Throughout the history of Western philosophy, two opposing views have taken hold and persisted. Despite the vast changes and revolutions in culture over the last 2,500 years, these two schools of thought have kept true to their original selves and remained virtually identical to what they once were. Defenders of both views are as readily available today as yesterday, despite every objection under the sun having been launched against both. The only difference between the historical and contemporary versions is the plethora of new denominations of these views. Problems with older views are pointed out, requiring one to either tweak the view so as to avoid the problem, or abandon the view altogether, often in favor of some version of the opposing view. Almost invariably, the modified views are haunted by the very complications they were created to avoid. The problems are shifted around or masked by a new vocabulary that gives the illusion of breaking new ground. As soon as the problems are rediscovered, the task again becomes finding a way to solve them. But because they are merely the same problems shaded differently, it's ever so easy to come up with seemingly new responses that, in reality, simply restate the old responses to the old problems. Round and round it goes. It's probable that some of my own supposed quote-unquote breakthroughs will fall into this same pattern, but I hope my awareness of this can safeguard against its realization. Hegel noted something similar regarding the shallowness of standard philosophical debate. Quote, "The more that conventional opinion gets fixated on the antithesis of truth and falsity, the more it tends to expect a given philosophical system to be either accepted or contradicted, and hence it finds only acceptance or rejection. It does not comprehend the diversity of philosophical systems as the progressive unfolding of truth, but rather sees it in simple disagreements." Unquote. I wish not to abandon the quote-unquote incorrect view for the correct view, but to determine the limits of each view, just as Newtonian physics wasn't abandoned when it failed to accurately describe the movements of universally massive objects, and later quantum particles. Newton's work was not discarded. Its specific failures were noted, and new conceptions of physics were proposed to reconcile its accuracies with its inaccuracies. It is this very tension between accuracy and inaccuracy that determines the form a view's resolution must take. Again by Hegel, quote, "By the little which now satisfies spirit, we can measure the extent of its loss." Unquote. A view can be correct on some matters and incorrect on others, and it's just as valid to demand resolution of a view's inaccuracy as it is to inquire why, if the view is flawed, it nevertheless accurately explains or predicts some range of data. Stated in the reverse, it's just as valid to demand explanation of a view's accuracy as it is to inquire why, if the view is correct, it nevertheless errs in its explanations or predictions. One search uncovers the extent of the view's reach. The other arrives at the perimeter of the view's reach. And thus, the overarching goal of both is to arrive through separate lenses, that is, through different methods, at the same conceptual shape. That is, both inquiries take different routes to ideally arrive at the same destination. One begins internally and sees how far it can traverse without exiting the view's domain, and the other begins externally and sees how close it can get without entering the domain. As scientists are well aware, if a new theory is to overtake the current theory, the new theory must not only be more plausible, it must also provide insight as to why the current theory is partially accurate but breaks down at some level. Now that all this has been noted, we may dive into our analysis of the two schools of thought, their problems, and their proposed solutions. Views loosely associated with the first philosophical outlook include empiricism, naturalism, materialism, and atomism. As such, this outlook can be called naturalistic empiricism. Naturalistic empiricism is typically seen as the more common sense view and rejects making conclusions about the world from supposedly a priori first principles, that is, necessary truths which are literally impossible to doubt and are somehow known prior to any experience. Regarding a priori knowledge, the empiricist David Hume said that, quote, "In all demonstrative sciences, the rules are certain and infallible. But when we apply them, our fallible and uncertain faculties are very apt to depart from them and fall into error. By this means, all knowledge degenerates into probability," unquote. There is no truly a priori knowledge because such knowledge would be inherently certain, and we know nothing with complete certainty. This isn't to say there is nothing necessary in reality, just that we know nothing with absolute certainty. I also don't want to give the impression that empiricists must be naturalists, or vice versa, though it's historically and conceptually clear why these views so easily complement each other. Instead of relying on a priori principles, direct experience of the natural world, or acquaintance, as Bertrand Russell calls it, is necessary for all knowledge whatsoever. If we've experienced nothing of a certain type, we can't know the nature of things of that type, as evidenced by the difficulty that lifelong blind people have in conceiving of vision. Taken to its logical endpoint, if there were no experiences of anything, there would be no knowledge. Because we only perceive natural things, our senses are only attuned to these things, as far as we can tell, and we can only have knowledge that is directly or indirectly grounded in experience, it follows that all our knowledge is of natural things. We have no real knowledge of transcendent things, and thus have no grounds on which to affirm their reality. Similar to the bottom-up view of knowledge, there's an implicit bottom-up approach to consciousness. Because the natural world is viewed as all there is, it follows that any conscious experience must be born of purely natural causes. The universe's history of development is such that physical beings capable of thought and action have arisen. Consciousness is fundamentally a byproduct of nature, that is, Physical reality is fundamental and consciousness is derived from it. Views loosely associated with the second philosophical outlook include rationalism, supernaturalism, idealism, and holism. As such, this outlook can be called idealistic rationalism. Again, this doesn't preclude the existence of views such as idealistic empiricism. Bishop Berkeley would have been an example of that. Idealistic rationalism rejects the empiricist claim that experience is the only road to knowledge. For example, how could any amount of experience justify believing a necessary truth, like 2 plus 2 equals 4? The most we could learn from experience is that, in every case so far, 2 things plus 2 more things have equaled 4 things. Therefore, future examples of 2 things added to 2 things will almost certainly result in there being 4 things. But this doesn't justify what we actually know. Our belief isn't merely that 2 plus 2 always contingently happens to be 4, in the same way it might contingently happen to be that the laws of nature always hold. Rather, our belief is that 2 plus 2 necessarily equals 4. And, quote, it does not seem possible that truths so apparent can be suspected of any falsity or uncertainty, unquote. That was Descartes from the First Meditation. But again, no amount of experience can prove what must necessarily be the case. There must be a source of justification beyond perception that we are aware of and can access. Otherwise, we wouldn't know that 2 plus 2 necessarily equals 4. The different proposed sources of this justification, for example, connection to God, have determined the types of idealistic rationalism that have arisen historically. The idealist view of consciousness, unlike the naturalistic bottom-up assembly of fundamental matter into a physical being with thought, is that consciousness, or mental reality, is the fundamental ground of all reality. This could be taken as a cause-effect relationship, with mind as the fundamental cause of everything. For example, you could read John 1:1, in the beginning was the Logos, as something similar to that. There's some prime principle of reality that leads to every other part of reality. Or it could be taken as a part-whole relationship, with mind as the fundamental whole of everything. An easy-to-grasp example of the former view is found in the common religious notion that God, a personal mind, created and sustains all things. All is grounded in God. Similarly, the latter view is sometimes expressed as pantheism, the view that the universe is God, and humans are thus momentary fragments, participating in God's ongoing process. I'm reminded of St. Paul saying, "In God we live and move and have our being." Everything we take to be physical is actually grounded in mental reality. Hence, the physical can give rise to minds because it already contains at its core that seed of mentality. Some idealists have been subjectivists, believing that reality just is the sum total of all experience. Nothing exists beyond first-person experience. These idealists will often appeal to Occam's razor, noting that less assumptions are made by assuming experience is all that exists, as opposed to assuming that in addition to experience, some unknowable reality in itself exists and has its own powers. Note the interesting similarity and difference here between empiricism and subjective idealism. Empiricism holds that all knowledge is gained through experience, and subjective idealism holds that all reality is experience. Just a cool kind of analog there. The only difference is the domain over which experience is ruler, knowledge versus reality, which are curiously similar concepts. Regardless of the domain we speak of, both emphasize the supremacy of subjective experience. Some have gone even further down the subjectivist road to solipsism, the view that my perceptions are the only thing in existence. But this view remains extremely uncommon. Subjective idealism is often viewed as radical because, while affirming experience, it denies any clear basis or explanation for these experiences. After all, why am I having these rather than those experiences? Others, like Plato, Descartes, and Hegel, not to mention many religious people around the world, are more objective in their idealism. According to Plato, all particular things receive their being from a single, eternal, unchanging, and non-physical source, what he called the good, the ground of all reality. The non-physical is the idea or form which the physical imperfectly exemplifies. We could say that on such a view, form is to material as blueprint is to building. The form and the blueprint come first. Descartes held that the seeming existence of objects actually results from the workings of the mind. A ball of wax is perceived as a unitary object, separate from all the world's other objects. Not because of its physical properties, all of which can be altered to an unrecognizable state, but because I am that being which sees the once solid wax as the same object as the now liquid wax. Were no subject to exist, there would be no multiplicity of objects, but rather just a nondescript blob, so to speak, of reality. It wouldn't even be a blob because we have a conception of a blob in our heads. It would be a blob in the sense of being completely ambiguous. Why, then, do humans categorize as they do? If we are ultimately the ones who choose how we are going to see objects, and if we are the ones who give objects their sort of distinctness from the rest of reality, why do we judge things like chairs as chairs? Why do we feel compelled to recognize a chair as one thing? How do we recognize objects? For Descartes, the answer is found in our connection to God. God, the infinite mind, is the source given to and accessed by us, finite minds, when we perceive an object. Before speaking on the metaphysical materialism and idealism debate, it's necessary to speak on the epistemic empiricism and rationalism debate. As we've seen, both views have a strong argument supporting their conceptions of knowledge. Empiricism gets its bite because it truly is impossible to possess knowledge in the absence of experience. The very acts of knowing and learning are inherently experiences. We can describe what they feel like. The notion of someone learning or knowing while perceiving absolutely nothing is unintelligible because experience is fundamental to both. Rationalism gets its bite because I truly know that 2 + 2 necessarily equals 4, and I know I am not only justified, but correct in this belief. But I also know experience cannot justify this belief. The justification must be grounded in something other than experience. But this means experience can't be the only road to knowledge. Something in the empiricist understanding of knowledge must be missing. But what?